The attic light was on again. That was the first thing I noticed the night after my father's funeral. It was past midnight, and the house was drowning in silence, the kind of silence that hums in your ears, heavy and endless. I had gone downstairs for a glass of water, and when I looked up the staircase, I saw that faint amber glow leaking from under the attic door. My heart gave a slow, uncertain thud. That light shouldn't have been on. No one was supposed to be up there. For a second, I wondered if maybe I'd forgotten to switch it off earlier. I had been sorting through boxes all day. But something about it didn't feel right. There was movement, too. A shadow, faint and slow, passing by the crack of light. I remember gripping the handrail, frozen between fear and confusion. I whispered my dad's name, "Dad?" before realizing how ridiculous that was. He was gone. Buried. I stood there until the shadow disappeared and the light flicked off. Then, just like that, the house went silent again. I didn't sleep that night. Before I go any further, I should tell you, my name is Clara, and I had been living in my father's house for just over a month when all of this began. I came back after his heart attack. It was sudden, and I didn't want him to be alone. My mother had passed years ago, and after her, he'd grown quieter, more withdrawn. We weren't estranged exactly, but there had always been a kind of distance. Polite, careful, like we were walking on glass. Still, when he called one evening and said, "I think I'd like you to come home for a while," I didn't hesitate. I left my apartment in the city and came back to the creaky old two-story house I grew up in. For a while, life felt almost peaceful again. Dad would sit in his armchair by the window every morning, reading the newspaper with that same ritualistic sigh before turning each page. I'd make coffee, one black, one with too much milk, and we'd talk about small things, the weather, his garden, the old neighbors. Never anything deep, but somehow it was enough. He looked older, of course. His hands shook a little when he reached for his mug, but his eyes, those steady blue eyes, still carried that quiet intelligence I always admired. Sometimes, though, I'd hear creaks from upstairs, from the attic. And every time I asked, he'd just say, "Old house, Clara. Wood expands when it's cold." And I believed him. The day of the funeral felt like moving through fog. I remember standing beside the casket, clutching a folded handkerchief that smelled faintly of his cologne. People came and went, neighbors, co-workers, people I hadn't seen since childhood. They said the same words in different ways. He was a good man. He'll be missed. You were such a good daughter. But grief has a strange way of muting everything. It doesn't always look like crying or wailing. Sometimes it's just standing in your childhood living room, hearing your own breathing, and realizing there's no one else left to call Dad. After the service, the lawyer, a polite man named Mr. Grayson, handed me a sealed envelope. It was thick, heavier than I expected. Dad's handwriting on the front. To be opened privately by Clara. My fingers trembled as I opened. It inside was his will. I remember reading the first. Few lines with a soft kind of pride. He'd left instructions for donations to his favorite charities, notes of gratitude to old friends. And then, when I reached the section about the estate, my eyes stopped. I hereby leave the house, its contents, and remaining savings to my dear friend, Martin Hale, who has resided with me these past years. I reread the line twice, then 3 times. Martin Hale? The name didn't ring a bell, and the words, "has resided with me these past years," made my stomach twist. I blinked hard, thinking maybe I'd misunderstood. But there it was, my father's signature at the bottom, a legal witness, not a single mention of me beyond a line that read, "To my daughter, Clara, I hope she understands." I dropped the papers onto the table. The sound echoed through the empty living room. For a long moment, I just stood there, staring at the ceiling. And that's when I heard it again. the faintest creak from the attic. In the days that followed, I tried to be rational. Maybe it was some kind of clerical error. Maybe this Martin person was an old friend, someone Dad was helping. But no matter how I tried to reason it out, one truth kept tightening in my chest. Someone had been living in my father's attic, and I had never known. The attic had always been Dad's space. He kept old tools up there, photo boxes, even some furniture from before Mom died. He'd told me more than once that the stairs were weak and I shouldn't go up there. I'd respected that, but now I couldn't stop thinking about that light, that shadow. On the third night after the funeral, I decided I had to know. The air felt heavy when I reached the top of the stairs. Dust clung to my throat, and the old wooden boards groaned under my feet. I pushed open the attic door slowly, half expecting to find nothing but cobwebs and cardboard boxes. But what I saw stopped me cold. There was a bed. A neatly made single bed with gray sheets, a desk cluttered with books, a coffee mug, a folded shirt draped over a chair. Someone had been living there, recently. And then I heard movement. Behind me, a man's voice, quiet but steady, said, "You shouldn't be up here, Clara." I spun around. He was standing by the doorway, tall, maybe late 40s, with salt and pepper hair and tired eyes. He wasn't threatening, but there was something about the calmness in his tone that made my skin prickle. "Who are you?" I demanded. My voice came out smaller than I wanted. He sighed. "I'm Martin." For a few seconds the words didn't register. Then they did. The name from the will. I felt my knees weaken. "You're Martin Hale?" He nodded. "Your father's friend." I stared at him, trying to connect the dots, trying to make sense of the absurdity. "You lived here? In this house?" "Yes," he said. "For the past 3 years. 3 years. That was long before Dad ever mentioned needing company. Long before I came home." I took a step back. Why? Why didn't he tell me? He hesitated, then said softly, "He wanted to, but he knew you wouldn't understand." The words hit like a slap. "What wouldn't I understand?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer, just looked down, almost sadly, like there was something too big to explain in that moment. I felt anger rise up through the confusion, hot, bitter, protective. "That's my father's house," I said. "You need to leave." He didn't move. "I can't." And that's when I realized he wasn't planning to. Not tonight. Not ever. That night, I locked my bedroom door for the first time in my life. I lay awake listening to every sound, the creak of the pipes, the ticking of the clock, the faint shuffle of footsteps above my ceiling, and as the darkness stretched into dawn, one thought kept circling in my head, heavy and relentless. What else had my father been hiding from me? I woke up the next morning with a dry throat and a strange tightness behind my ribs. The sunlight pouring through the curtains felt too sharp, too clean for the chaos still swirling in my mind. For a while, I just sat there on the edge of the bed, staring at the old wallpaper, listening. No sound from the attic, no footsteps, only the steady hum of the refrigerator downstairs. I tried to convince myself that I'd imagined it all. The will, the man, the conversation. Maybe I was grieving, maybe I'd dreamt it, but when I walked downstairs and saw the half-empty coffee mug sitting on the kitchen counter, I knew it hadn't been a dream. There it was, a chipped white mug I didn't recognize. Steam still rose from it. He was here, still here. I found him later that morning, sitting at the dining table as though he belonged there. He had a folded newspaper in one hand, glasses perched low on his nose. The casualness of it made my skin crawl. "Morning," he said quietly. Without looking up, I stared at him, too angry to reply. When he finally did meet my eyes, he added, "Your father used to make breakfast around this time. Pancakes, on weekends." I clenched my jaw. You think that gives you the right to sit here like nothing's happened? He sighed, folded the paper neatly, and set it aside. Clara, I know this is difficult, but your father wanted me here. He made it very clear. You were living in his attic, I snapped. Secretly, while his own daughter had no idea. He didn't want to worry you. Worry me about what? I demanded. Martin hesitated, and for a brief second I thought I saw something flicker behind his eyes. Guilt, or maybe pity. Your father was sick long before you knew, he said finally. Heart problems, breathing trouble. He didn't want to tell you because you'd panic. He wanted to live his life quietly, and he needed help around the house. I gave him that. His tone was measured, deliberate, too calm. So you were his caretaker? I asked. Yes. And his friend. I folded my arms. And for that he left you everything? The house, the savings, all of it? He didn't flinch. He wanted to make sure I'd be taken care of, too. I laughed, a short, hollow sound. Taken care of? He had a daughter. I'm his family. Yes, he said softly. But family isn't always the same as presence. Clara, the words cut deep. Before I could respond, he stood, gathered his paper, and said quietly, You should eat something. Then he walked out toward the back porch, as though this were his home. Not mine. That day I called the lawyer. Mr. Grayson sounded sympathetic but firm. Everything was signed and witnessed properly, he said. I've known your father for years. He was very clear about his intentions. Did you know this man? I asked. Martin? Yes, your father introduced us last year. He said Martin helped him with his health, errands, paperwork, all sorts of things. I swallowed hard. And you didn't think it was strange he never mentioned him to me? Mr. Grayson's pause told me he had thought it, but wouldn't say so. Your father was private, Clara. He trusted this man deeply. I thanked him and hung up. But my hands were shaking. Private or not, Dad had built a whole life I knew nothing about. Over the next week, Martin's presence became an uncomfortable routine. He was polite, painfully polite. He cooked, cleaned, even mowed the lawn like some quiet ghost of domestic order. And yet I couldn't stand being in the same room with him. Every small sound, the clink of a cup, the creak of the stairs, made my shoulders tense. He wasn't cruel or rude, but he was too comfortable, too sure of his place. I started going through Dad's old things in the evenings, not out of nostalgia, but suspicion. I checked the drawers, the shelves, his notebooks. I was looking for something, anything, that could explain why he'd done this. That's when I found the first letter. It was tucked between the pages of one of his gardening books. A folded note, yellowed and creased. My father's handwriting covered one side of the page. Martin, thank you for everything you've done. I know Clara will never understand, but you've been more of a son to me than she could bear to believe. When the time comes, I trust you'll take care of this place, and yourself. R. I stared at the letter for a long time. More of a son. Those 4 words hollowed me out. I sank to the floor, clutching the paper, my chest tightening. It wasn't just about the will anymore. It was about love, misplaced, misunderstood love. Did my father think I hadn't cared? That I hadn't been there for him? I'd moved back home. I'd cooked his meals. I'd driven him to doctor's appointments. And yet he'd written this quiet betrayal sealed in ink. Tears burned my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. That night, I didn't speak to Martin at all. But I heard him humming softly upstairs, a tune I recognized. My father's favorite old jazz record. It made me want to scream. The next morning, I decided to dig deeper. I searched the attic again, this time when Martin had gone out to get groceries. His side of the room was neat, almost obsessively organized, but there were boxes near the window, boxes I didn't remember seeing before. I opened the first one. Inside were photo frames, my father in his chair, smiling, and beside him, always, Martin, not me. The next box held receipts, letters, prescriptions. Martin's name on hospital forms. He'd been signing documents with my father, paying bills, managing everything. The last box made my stomach twist. It held my father's old wristwatch, the one he promised I'd inherit. Next to it, a sealed envelope labeled, "For Clara, when you're ready." My hands trembled as I opened it. "My dearest Clara, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And I know you're angry, probably at me and maybe at Martin. But I need you to know this wasn't about love or rejection. It was about trust. Martin stayed when I couldn't do much for myself. He saw me through nights you never saw. You have your life, Clara, and I wanted you to live it freely. I didn't want you burdened by this house, by me. Don't see this as a theft. See it as a gift, the kind I couldn't explain when I was alive." I sat there for what felt like hours, my heart twisting between grief and fury. How could he think giving everything away would free me? All it did was trap me in a house full of ghosts. That night when Martin came home, I was waiting in the kitchen. The letter lay flat on the table. He froze when he saw it. "You read it," he said quietly. "Yes," I said. "And you're going to tell me everything." He looked tired, like a man who'd been waiting for this moment. "I'll tell you what you want," he said. "But you might not like it." I folded my arms. "Try me." He took a deep breath, then sat down. "Your father and I met at the clinic 3 years ago. He was there for tests. I was volunteering. We got talking. He was lonely, Clara. Not in the way people pity the elderly, but in that deep, hollow way that comes from silence. You reminded him too much of your mother," he said. "You left because you needed to, and he understood that. But it hurt him." His words settled heavy in the air. "He asked me to stay, just for a while. Said the house felt too big. 1 month became 3, then a year. I looked after him, yes. But he looked after me too. I'd lost my family years before. We filled each other's empty spaces." He looked up, his eyes damp. "It wasn't about money, Clara. Not for me." I didn't know whether to believe him. But something in his voice, that quiet grief, felt true. Still, truth didn't make it easier. Then why didn't he tell me? I whispered. Martin's voice broke just a little. "Because he was afraid you'd leave again. And that was the first time I didn't know who to be angry at. My father, for shutting me out. Or myself, for not noticing sooner. That night, I couldn't sleep. The words, 'He was afraid you'd leave again,' kept echoing through my mind. Round and round until they lost meaning. Maybe it was the way Martin said them, not cruelly, but with this deep, quiet certainty that made me feel both exposed and guilty. I lay staring at the ceiling, my father's old fan turning above me, its blades whispering in circles. I thought about the years I'd stayed away, college, the job, the apartment, the boyfriends who never stayed long enough. I'd always told myself I was independent, that Dad understood. But what if he hadn't? What if every silence on the phone, every short visit, had carved something deeper than I'd realized? And now here I was, back in his house, surrounded by his things, feeling like a stranger. The next morning, I made coffee for both of us. Not because I wanted to, but because I didn't know what else to do. Martin came downstairs quietly, his hair still damp from a shower. He looked surprised when he saw the 2 mugs. "I figured you still take it black," I said flatly. He nodded, sitting across from me. For a moment, the kitchen felt almost normal. 2 people sharing a morning. But then I remembered the will, the attic, the years of secrets, and the illusion broke. I slid a file across the table. I went through Dad's papers last night. He tensed slightly but didn't speak. I found more than just the letter, I continued. Bank statements, transfers. You've been getting money from him for years. He exhaled slowly. He insisted on it. He said I shouldn't feel ashamed for the help I gave. You were paid to stay. I was given help, he corrected. Your father didn't want charity between us. I stared at him. And you never thought to tell me? Never thought I had the right to know who was living with my father, who was handling his money. I respected his wishes, Martin said quietly. That's all I ever did. His calmness infuriated me. I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping sharply against the floor. You don't belong here, Martin. Whatever agreement you had died with him. He looked down at his hands, weathered, steady. I do belong here. He made sure of that. Not if I contest the will, I snapped. And believe me, I will. He met my gaze then, finally, and what I saw there wasn't fear. It was sadness. You could, he said softly, but it won't change what he felt. You'll win the house, maybe, the money, but you'll lose what little of him you have left, the truth of who he was at the end. I felt tears burn my eyes, but anger forced them back. Don't you dare talk about him like you knew him better than I did. He didn't respond. He just stood, picked up his mug, and walked out to the porch again. That quiet dignity that made me hate him even more. Days passed like that. We moved around each other like two ghosts trapped in the same haunting. He stayed mostly in the attic, leaving early in the mornings, coming back at dusk. I avoided him, burying myself in errands that didn't need doing, grocery runs, long walks through town, sorting old clothes. But one afternoon, as I was going through my father's desk drawers, I found something that made my blood run cold, a stack of old photographs. The first few were harmless, family pictures, my parents' anniversary, my high school graduation, but near the bottom, tucked behind an envelope, were recent photos. My father, frail but smiling. Martin beside him, holding a book, helping him to the garden. And then, one photo that made my stomach twist, the two of them at a lawyer's office. The same office where I'd later sit, reading my father's will, on the back, in my father's handwriting. So she'll understand later. The words blurred as tears welled in my eyes. I didn't know whether to cry or scream. I felt manipulated, like my father had been building a narrative I wasn't allowed to be part of. That night, I finally confronted Martin again. He was sitting on the porch, the late summer air heavy with crickets. I stood in the doorway, the photos in my hand. You were part of this, I said. He looked up slowly. Part of what? This? I thrust the photos at him. You planned this with him. You made sure I'd be left out. He took the photos, looked at them quietly, and then said, No, Clara, he planned it. I only helped him follow through. Why didn't you stop him? He gave a sad little smile, because he believed it was right. And I wasn't his daughter. It wasn't my place to challenge him. I stared at him, my voice shaking. He thought you were his son. His eyes flickered. Maybe he did, but that's not why I stayed. Then why, Martin? Why live in a stranger's attic for 3 years? What did you want from him? He hesitated, and for the first time I saw something raw, something deeply human, flash across his face. Forgiveness, he said quietly. I frowned. For what? He looked away, his voice barely above a whisper. For my own father. I wasn't there when he died. I was too proud, too stubborn. I spent 10 years hating myself for it. When I met your dad, he reminded me of the kind of man mine used to be. I thought maybe, if I could care for him, it would mean something. The anger in me wavered, just slightly. He continued, his eyes distant. Your father knew about my past. He said we were two men haunted by absence. He forgave me for mine, and I think he hoped you'd forgive him for his. I didn't know what to say. The night around us seemed to still. Even the crickets quieted. I don't want your pity, I whispered. He shook his head. And I don't want your forgiveness. But don't think your father loved you less, Clara. He just loved differently. When I went back inside, I stood in the hallway. looking at the framed family photos, my mother's soft smile, my father's steady eyes, and for the first time, I realized how many pieces of him I'd never known. The father who laughed too loudly when I was small. The man who stopped smiling after Mom died. The man who let a stranger move into his home, perhaps because he couldn't stand the echo of his own loneliness anymore. It didn't excuse it, but it made him human, and somehow, that made it hurt more. The next morning, I packed a small suitcase, not to leave, not yet, but because I needed space to think. I told Martin I was going to stay at a friend's for a few days. He didn't ask where. He just nodded. As I was about to leave, he said, "Clara." I turned. He held out something small, my father's wristwatch. "The one I thought he'd taken. He wanted you to have it," Martin said softly. He just didn't know how to give it without losing the rest. I stared at the watch, its face scratched, the leather strap worn smooth. It smelled faintly of the oil my father used to polish it. For a long moment, I couldn't speak. Finally, I took it. "Thank you." He nodded once, and I walked out into the sunlight, feeling like I was leaving behind not just a house, but a version of myself, the daughter who thought love and fairness were the same thing. That night, in my friend's guest room, I lay awake staring at the ceiling again. But this time, it was different. The betrayal still stung. But beneath it, there was something else. A strange, aching kind of understanding. Maybe this was what love really was. Messy, uneven, never the shape we expect. And maybe, just maybe, I could learn to live with that. I stayed away for 5 days. 5 days of silence, coffee gone cold on the table, half-written texts to a man who was no longer alive to answer them. I thought distance would make it easier. It didn't. Everywhere I went, I saw small reminders. A bookstore window displaying one of Dad's favorite authors, a man at the park with the same slow, deliberate walk. Even the sound of someone's laughter on the bus made my chest tighten because it sounded like his, in another life. Grief has this way of sneaking up on you when you start feeling steady again. But under the grief, there was also something else growing. Determination. I couldn't keep letting Martin live in my father's house while I stayed away like an exile. My father might have written that will, but I was still his blood, his daughter, and I had to know if there was anything that could be done, legally, if not emotionally. So, on the 6th day, I went back. The house looked smaller when I pulled into the driveway. The paint peeling a little near the porch, the overgrown vines curling around the fence. It didn't look like my home anymore. It looked like something borrowed. When I stepped inside, the smell hit me first. Coffee and dust. The faint trace of my father's cologne had faded completely now. Martin wasn't in the kitchen or living room. I heard faint movement upstairs. For a second, I considered turning around, but then I remembered why I was here. I walked to the study, pulled out the file of documents again, the will, the bank records, everything I'd found. I took a deep breath and called Mr. Grayson, the lawyer. He answered on the 2nd ring. "Mr. Grayson, it's Clara," I said. "I need to know if the will can be contested." There was a pause, and then a quiet sigh on the other end. "You've read it carefully, I assume?" "Yes." "Then you already know your father was of sound mind when he wrote it." "I witnessed it myself." "I know that," I said, frustration creeping in. "But there's something wrong about it. He left everything to a man who isn't family, who lived in his attic." Mr. Grayson hesitated. "Morally, perhaps, but legally, it's valid, unless you can prove undue influence." "Undue influence?" He explained how I'd have to prove that Martin manipulated or pressured my father when he was vulnerable, that the decision wasn't his own. As he spoke, I stared at the framed photo on the wall. My father, smiling, arm around me at my college graduation. The memory of that day flickered like an old film reel, the pride in his eyes, the way he said, "Make a life that's yours." Clara, maybe he'd meant it too literally. "Can I see a copy of the signed witness document?" I asked. "I can send it to you," he said. "But Clara, I'd advise you to think carefully. Even if you win, it won't bring peace." "Maybe not," I said quietly, "but it might bring fairness." That night, I started gathering evidence, emails, receipts, messages, anything showing how much control Martin had over my father's finances. It wasn't about revenge. It was about clarity. In the process, I came across something unexpected, an email chain between my father and Mr. Grayson from almost 2 years ago. The subject line read, "Revised Will Draft," and there, buried halfway down the thread, was my name. "I want to ensure Clara gets the savings account, but not the property. She's not meant to stay trapped in this house." The final version, the one filed after that, had removed me. Completely, something had changed between those drafts, and I needed to know. What? When I confronted Martin the next morning, he was sitting in the garden, trimming the hedges like nothing had happened. "Why did he change his will?" I asked. He looked up slowly. "He told you?" "No," I said. "I found the emails." Martin set down the shears, wiped his hands on a towel, and took a deep breath. "He changed it after your last visit." I frowned. "Last visit? You mean?" "3 years ago," he said. "You came for his birthday. You stayed a day and left before dinner." I remembered that visit, vaguely. I'd been in a hurry, juggling work, a strained relationship. I brought him a sweater he never wore. I'd left early because of an argument, something small, something about responsibility, I think. "He told me that night," Martin continued, "that he didn't want you tied to this house. He said it had too many memories for you. He wanted to give you a chance to start over." My throat tightened. "He didn't even ask me." "He didn't need to. He thought he knew your heart." I wanted to scream, but the anger came out quieter this time. "That wasn't his choice to make." "No," Martin said softly. "But parents make choices they think are love, even when they hurt." The wind rustled the leaves. The air between us felt heavy, like all the words we hadn't said were pressing down. Finally, I said, "I'm contesting the will." He nodded once. "Then I'll cooperate. If that's what you need to do to find peace, I won't stop you." His calmness disarmed me again, that same quiet. Acceptance that made him impossible to hate, completely. The next few weeks were a blur of paperwork and meetings. Mr. Grayson stayed professional but wary, and Martin kept his distance. He moved out of the attic and into a small rental nearby, leaving the house in my care until things were resolved. For the first time since Dad died, the house was silent again. Truly silent. At night, I'd sit in the living room, surrounded by the ghost of his presence, the indent in his chair, the faint marks on the coffee table where he used to rest his mug. I wondered if I was really fighting for justice, or just fighting the loneliness he'd left behind. One evening, as I was sorting through more of his things, I found a small cassette tape in a drawer labeled simply, "For Clara." My heart lurched. I hadn't seen a tape player in years, but there was an old one in the attic. I carried it downstairs, trembling as I pressed play, a faint static, then my father's voice, soft, weary, but unmistakably him. "Clara, if you're hearing this, I've probably gone. I know you're angry. Maybe you should be. But please know I never meant to hurt you. When you left for college, I was proud. But the house got quiet. Too quiet. Martin came around by accident, helping with some work outside, and stayed because he listened. Not because he was family, but because he made the silence bearable. I didn't want to trap you here. I wanted you to live, to love, to be free. I left this place to someone who needed a home, and left you the freedom not to need one." The tape clicked off. I sat there, shaking, tears spilling down my face, not from anger this time, but something harder to name, because maybe, in his own flawed way, my father had loved me enough to let me go. The next morning, I called my lawyer and told him to stop the case. Mr. Grayson was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Are you sure, Clara?" "Yes," I said. He made his choice, and now I'm making mine. That afternoon, I drove to Martin's small rental. He opened the door, surprised to see me. "I'm not contesting the will," I said. He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. "I see. I still don't agree with what happened," I continued. "But I understand it now. My father, he was trying to give us both something we needed. You, a home. Me, the chance to walk away." A small smile tugged at his mouth. "He'd be proud of you for seeing that." I handed him a small box. Inside was the wristwatch he'd given me. "He wanted me to have this," I said. "But I think you should keep it." Martin blinked, his voice rough when he spoke. "Clara, consider it a truce," I said softly. He looked down at the watch for a long time, then whispered, "Thank you," and for the first time, I meant it. As I drove away, I felt something lift, not joy, not relief, but a quiet kind of peace. Maybe some inheritances aren't made of money or property. Maybe they're made of lessons, the kind you only learn when you're forced to lose something. Word spread fast in small towns. By the end of that week, the story had already made its way through the church group, the grocery store, and every corner cafe where retired neighbors liked to trade whispers over tea. "Did you hear? Richard's daughter got written out of the will. They say he left the house to some man who lived with him. Can you imagine? After all she did for him?" I tried not to listen, but gossip has a way of finding you, even when you don't look for it. The first time it reached me directly was at the post office. Mrs. Ellison, an old friend of my father's, tilted her head kindly and said, "Oh, Clara dear, you must be heartbroken. Don't you worry. The truth always comes out." Her words were meant as comfort, but they felt like pity wrapped in lace. The truth had come out, but not the one anyone would understand. Not the kind of truth that fits neatly into town gossip. So I just smiled, thanked her, and left before my throat could close up. Martin, on the other hand, became something of a mystery legend in town. Some said he'd conned my father. Others said he was a saint who'd cared for him when I hadn't. The versions multiplied like shadows, all wrong, all twisted, and for a while I let them. I didn't correct anyone. It wasn't my job to explain love that didn't make sense to people who'd never seen its edges. But when I saw Martin again, I realized the rumors were hurting him more than me. He was at the farmer's market, quiet as always, buying tomatoes. 2 women stood nearby, whispering loud enough for him to hear. Words like thief and gold digger cut through the air. He kept his head down, pretending not to notice. But his hands shook slightly when he handed the money to the vendor. I walked up beside him, took a deep breath, and said loud enough for the whispers to stop, "Martin." "I didn't expect to see you here." He looked up, startled. I smiled. "How have you been?" The 2 women turned away, their curiosity instantly deflating. Martin hesitated, then said softly, "I've been fine. Trying to stay busy." "Good," I said. "You should." We stood there in that small, awkward silence, but something about it felt right, honest. After a moment he said, "You didn't have to do that." "I know," I replied, "but I wanted to." He gave me a small nod, and I could see the gratitude in his eyes, quiet, humble, the way my father's used to look when words failed him. A few weeks later, Mr. Grayson invited me to a small gathering to honor my father's memory. It was just a handful of people, colleagues, old friends, a few neighbors. I wasn't sure if I should go. But in the end I did. When I arrived, Martin was already there, standing near the back of the room, keeping to himself. Mr. Grayson spoke first, sharing stories of my father's patience, his generosity, his strange sense of humor. People laughed, teared up, nodded knowingly, and then, unexpectedly, he turned to me. "Clara," he said, "would you like to say something?" Every head turned. For a moment I wanted to say no, to hide behind the polite smile I'd mastered these past months. But then I thought of the cassette tape of my father's voice, and how even in death he was still trying to teach me something about letting go. So I stood. The room quieted. I took a slow breath. "My father wasn't perfect," I began. "But he was human, and I think sometimes that's the hardest thing to admit about the people we love." A soft murmur rippled through the crowd. "He made choices that hurt me. He kept things from me, but he also taught me something, that love isn't about who deserves more, or who gets the house or the inheritance. It's about who stays when things get quiet, who listens when no one else does." I looked toward Martin then. He met my eyes, and this time there was no anger between us, only understanding. "My father found someone who gave him comfort," I continued, "and I'm grateful he wasn't alone." The words surprised even me, because I realized as I said them that I meant everyone. When I sat back down, the silence was heavy, but not cold. Warm almost, like the pause after a prayer. After the memorial, a few people approached me quietly. "Your father would have been proud," one said. "You spoke with grace, dear," another murmured. And as strange as it felt, the weight I'd carried for months began to shift. Not gone, but lighter. Outside, the evening air was cool. The streetlights glowed amber against the fog. Martin caught up to me as I reached my car. "Clara," he said softly, "what you said in there, it meant more than you know." I shrugged. It was time people heard the truth. "The real one," he smiled faintly. "You gave him peace." "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe I just gave myself some." We stood in silence for a moment. Then I asked, "What will you do now?" "I think I'll fix the house up a bit," he said. "Maybe start a small carpentry business like I used to have." "Your father always said I should," I nodded. "He'd like that." He hesitated, then added, "You're welcome to visit any time." "It's still your home in a way." I smiled, not the bitter smile I used to wear, but a small, genuine one. "Maybe I will." And with that we parted ways, not as enemies, not even as strangers anymore, but as two people carrying different pieces of the same man. That night, I sat by my window and watched the moon rise over the quiet neighborhood. The street was still, the kind of stillness that once felt suffocating, but now it felt peaceful. I thought about my father again, how flawed, stubborn, and human he was, how he'd loved in the only way he knew how. And for the first time since he died, I whispered into the darkness, "I forgive you." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to, because they were finally enough. It's strange how time reshapes grief. At first, it was a storm, wild, suffocating, impossible to escape. Then it became a low tide that came and went when I least expected it. And now it's more like a steady ache, the kind that lives quietly inside you, but no longer controls every breath. A few months passed after the memorial. The town had moved on to newer gossip, and my father's story became one of those small-town myths that faded into soft nostalgia. People remembered him kindly again, the man who helped fix roofs, who grew the best tomatoes on the block, who told terrible jokes at the diner. I liked that. He deserved to be remembered that way, not as the man who left his daughter out of a will, but as the man who loved clumsily and tried his best. As for me, I sold my apartment in the city and moved into a smaller place near the coast, a quiet, old cottage with wide windows and the sound of waves just beyond the porch. It wasn't a house I inherited. It was one I chose. And somehow, that made all the difference. I started working remotely, editing manuscripts for small publishing houses. It was peaceful, in its own kind of loneliness. Every morning, I'd walk down to the beach with a cup of coffee, barefoot in the cool sand. I'd listen to the rhythm of the ocean, the gulls crying above, and think about my father's voice on that cassette tape. "You have your life, Clara," he'd said. "I didn't want you burdened by this house." I used to think that was cowardice, that he was running away from responsibility, from the closeness we could have had. But now I think he saw something I didn't. Maybe he knew I was always trying to fix him, to fill the silence he didn't want filled. Maybe he wanted me to build a life where love didn't have to come with guilt attached. Maybe this was his way of setting me free. Martin called once. A few weeks after I'd moved, his voice was calm, steady, familiar in a way that didn't sting anymore. He said he'd finished fixing the roof, repainted the porch, and was turning my father's old study into a small woodworking studio. "The house feels lighter now," he said. I smiled. "Good, it should." He paused, then added, "There's a place for you here, if you ever want it. Not out of obligation, just welcome." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. But then I realized I didn't need to decide right then. "Thank you," I said softly. "Maybe one day," and I meant it, one afternoon. As the sun sank low and the sea turned golden, I sat at my desk and took out the old wristwatch. It had become my ritual, winding it every Sunday morning, letting the tick-tick-tick remind me that time doesn't heal all things. But it changes them enough that healing becomes possible. I wore it not because of the inheritance or the betrayal, but because it reminded me of the better parts of my father, the parts that smelled like sawdust and coffee, that hummed old jazz songs while cooking eggs, that reached across silence to say I love you in small, imperfect ways. That's the thing about grief. It teaches you to stop waiting for the apology that may never come, and instead to listen for the love that was there all along, buried under the noise. A few months later, I got a letter in the mail, handwritten. Elegant cursive I recognized immediately. It was from Martin. "Clara, the house is finished. I kept your father's chair by the window, just like he liked it. Sometimes, when the afternoon light hits the floor just right, it feels like he's still there, not haunting the place, but blessing it. I'm not sure if you'll ever come back, but if you do, there will always be coffee on the table. Black for him, milky for you, M." I read it twice, maybe 3 times. Then I folded it carefully and placed it inside my father's old gardening book, the same one where I'd once found that letter saying, "More of a son than she could bear to believe." This time, the words didn't hurt, they just made me smile. That weekend, I drove back to the old house, not to stay, not to reclaim, just to visit. The drive felt shorter than I remembered. When I turned into the driveway, the vines had been trimmed, the paint was fresh, and the porch glowed softly in the late afternoon sun. Martin was in the yard, sanding a piece of wood. He looked up, surprised, then smiled. A real, unguarded smile. "You came," he said. "I did," I replied. "Just wanted to see it one last time," he nodded. "It's still yours, you know, in spirit." I walked through the house slowly, touching the walls, the familiar corners, the window ledge where my father used to rest his coffee. The air felt different, not heavy anymore, not haunted. I realized then that maybe love doesn't disappear when people do. It lingers, in the smell of old books, the worn grooves on a chair arm, the echo of laughter in a hallway. And maybe when you stop fighting it, it finally lets you breathe again. Before I left, I stood by the front door, looking at Martin. "You took good care of it," I said. He nodded. "I took care of him. The house just came with it," I smiled faintly. He would have liked that. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The wind carried the faint scent of lilacs from the garden. Finally, I said, "Goodbye, Martin." He gave me that same quiet nod my father used to give when words were too small for what he felt. And as I walked to my car, I realized it didn't feel like leaving anymore. It felt like closing a door gently, knowing it didn't have to lock behind me. That night, back in my cottage by the sea, I poured a cup of tea and sat by the window. The moon hung low over the water, calm and familiar. For the first time in a long while, I felt still, not broken, not angry, just still. And I think, if my father could see me now, he'd smile that small, quiet smile of his and say, "You finally found home." When I look back now, I realize it was never really about the house, not about the money or the will or even the man who lived in the attic. It was about understanding what love looks like when it stops being easy. See, I used to think love was supposed to be fair, that if you gave enough, stayed long enough, did everything right, you'd be rewarded with honesty, with loyalty, with clarity. But life and grief have a way of teaching you that love isn't an equation. Sometimes people love you in quiet ways you don't recognize until they're gone. Sometimes they love you clumsily, by giving away the very things you thought were yours. And sometimes they love you enough to let you misunderstand them, because explaining would only make it harder to say goodbye. I spent so much time being angry at my father for choosing someone else. But now I think maybe he wasn't choosing instead of me. Maybe he was choosing for me, to set me free from a life built on obligation and guilt. And maybe Martin wasn't my enemy at all. Maybe he was the mirror I needed to see what loneliness can do to a person, and what compassion can heal. Because healing, I've learned, doesn't always come wrapped in forgiveness. Sometimes it comes in understanding, soft, imperfect, slow. The house is still there. The will is still signed, and my father is still gone. But I carry him now, not through anger or regret, but through the quiet lessons he left behind. That love doesn't always arrive the way we expect it to. That letting go can sometimes be the truest form of keeping someone. And that forgiveness, real forgiveness, isn't a favor we give the dead. It's a gift we give ourselves so we can keep living. So if you're listening tonight, maybe you've been holding on to your own kind of inheritance, not money, but pain. Maybe someone you love left you with more questions than answers, more ache than comfort. If that's you, I hope you find your way back, not to what was, but to what's still possible. Because sometimes the home you lose just makes space for the one you're meant to build next. Would you have done what I did? Would you have fought for the will, or let it go to find your peace? Tell me in the comments below. And if you're still awake out there somewhere, remember, love doesn't always look fair. But sometimes it's enough just to see it for what it truly was. Good night, my dear listener. Sleep well.